Hello and welcome to the first ever episode of Underscored. I'm Stephen Kent, and this podcast is brought to you by Young Voices. This is a new show, very excited to break ground on a new program here and bring you reflections and analysis on the news, plus undercovered issues of the day. And I'll be doing this alongside emerging experts in the policy and journalism space. On this weekly roughly 30-minute program, you're going to hear from me, Young Voices staff and editorial team, as well as our deep bench of policy writers and political commentators who are working actively in their fields of expertise. We'll be doing this, and we hope to bring on regular special guests and recognizable names in the media. So hit that subscribe button and let's underscore what's important this week that you need to know or know more about. Now, some basic housekeeping that we need to go over first. This show is an outgrowth of what was previously the Young Voices podcast. You can find that out there online still if it's of interest to you. There's 100 plus episodes of interviews, but we're starting here today with a clean slate and infinite possibilities, truly infinite. You can find out more about Young Voices by going over to our website, www.young-voices.com. That's young-voices.com, and on Twitter at YVADV. So, today I am excited to welcome on to this seminal Underscored episode Brad Polumbo. He's the assistant editor here at Young Voices and co-host of the Hot Takes podcast, as well as John Dale Grover. John is the assistant managing editor of The National Interest, a prestigious foreign policy monthly out of Washington, D.C. Gentlemen, welcome to the podcast. So, last week, the Justice Department charged a Russian woman with conspiracy for allegedly attempting to meddle in the U.S. political system and then influence the 2008 midterm elections. Prosecutors are claiming that 44-year-old Elena Kasyanova managed the funds for, quote, Project Lakta, whose aim was to sow discord in the U.S. political system. And they do this by spreading misinformation online about contentious political issues such as immigration, gun control, the national anthem, what have you. Now, the criminal complaint unsealed this past Friday details an information warfare operation that ran through the U.S., the European Union, and the Ukraine from 2014 until today. John, you study and write actively on issues of national security and military affairs. How much does this kind of activity and this type of news around foreign powers concern you next to more traditional hard threats like our sudden dispute with Russia over the INF Treaty?
I think it's very concerning, but in a way that is more due to us than the actual nature of these kind of operations. So Russians call this active measures, so it's psyops. It's the kind of thing that's designed to mess with you psychologically, to put you off balance. And the reason why it's so dangerous is not because all the money that they're pouring into Facebook and social media is actually going to necessarily on its own tip anything, but because they are very good at playing at every single social cleavage of the culture war. And the more Americans post and get angry and do ad hominem attacks and just race to the bottom, that's the concern here more than anything else.
Brad, on the sideline, what are you making of all this? Kind of on the surface, a middle-aged Russian woman making memes and posting them on Facebook doesn't really seem like a national emergency, but there is something very grave and just sort of insidious being imposed upon the American people with all this. What do you make of it?
Well, again, I look at this issue more from the political lens, and it immediately jumps out to me that this is just the latest infringement from the Russians, directed likely by Vladimir Putin, basically attacking our elections. And it is an attempt to sow discord, but I think the real discord emerges in the response, right? Because I'm reading now that Facebook, in responding to things like this video campaign, like this disinformation campaign, has shut down 32 phony pages, profiles. Twitter has purged a bunch of users. They've deleted 10 million tweets that they thought represented foreign influence. So I think the biggest way that they're going to successfully sow discord is by disrupting our trust in social media, our trust in news that we see. Jeff Flake had an op-ed he wrote from his latest book about deep fakes, right? Video technology is progressing to the point where they may be able to create deep fakes, which are essentially videos that look just like real videos, where you could see Barack Obama giving a speech about something, except the video never happened. It's totally fabricated.
It seems to me that we're just not ready for these kinds of attacks and these kinds of threats with information. I mean, John, do you see a coherent response coming together in the realm of American politics and active government to this threat? Or do you think that we are behind the eight ball yet again on something?
I think we're behind the eight ball. Frankly, ever since, going back to the Russian-Georgian War, Russia's always been very good at tactics. They've always been slightly ahead of us, I think, in a lot of things. I think it's a mistake to say that Putin is this grand strategist who has this immense long-term vision that he's absolutely going to accomplish, some kind of puppet master thing. I just think he's a very good tactician. And the United States, we have so many things to worry about, commitments all across the globe, a divided political system. It's very hard for us to be incredibly coordinated. That being said, different parts of the bureaucracy, the intelligence community, security apparatuses, they're doing some stuff, but that's not enough because, again, on the state level, people need to respond to secure election infrastructure. But the most important thing is it's still largely up to us. It's up to individual Americans to decide how they respond to this, how they treat each other online, whether we want to engage in name and shame, Twitter mobs, taking pictures of someone we disagreed with, reposting it to another social media, making fun, laughing at them. That's the kind of stuff that really exacerbates all of this. So, the government can do a lot, but it's up to individual Americans to do their part.
Brad, just in doing a little bit of prep for this episode, and I'm glad that you mentioned the issue of Facebook pulling down these various sort of group pages. There was the sudden demise of the libertarian crown jewel of memery, libertarian memes, and punk rock libertarians on Facebook. And I literally just got back from a conference co-sponsored by Facebook where they assured small government groups in attendance that they are not the enemy of their movement. And then this happened on the final day of that meeting. Now, Brad, I know you sort of consume all of these sort of political memes and social media life. Do you see a connection between the removal of these Facebook pages being taken down and these outside influence campaigns? Because basically Americans are sort of looking at the removal of these pages and saying that that's sort of liberal gatekeeping or liberal bias. But Facebook is saying that, there's a lot of content on there that is put there for malicious purposes. And for that reason, these pages should not exist. Is it the right approach?
Well, I'm not sure that it is the right approach. And I think you're right that the only reason Facebook has really started doing this type of thing is because after the 2016 election, so many people looked at Mark Zuckerberg and pointed the finger and said, how could you guys let this happen on your programs, right? You, Jack Dorsey on Twitter, you, Mark Zuckerberg on Facebook, how could you have let this happen? So they were hit with enormous pressure, right? Mark Zuckerberg testified in front of Congress. And that as a result, they've tried to do these types of, I guess, purges on their services. And that's the problem, is that once you start purging accounts, even if you originally start with the goal of just eliminating fake news, right, that's so subjective. And that's when you could see some liberal bias or just some mistakes made. And that's when you get funny meme accounts taken down. So I think the real solution needs to be user focused, right? Users need to do a better job for themselves of determining what articles they can trust, what content is legitimate, and looking at things skeptically. I don't think any company or big top-down solution is going to work.
But that's kind of the problem here with, just even creating a meme. It doesn't need to be fake news or false information that you put into a joke, like you might have with some of these, maybe NPC memes that are very popular right now, making fun of mainstream political discourse. It could just be that it was made by someone with ill will. And does that qualify it as something that is malicious and needs to be taken down, even if, the vast majority of the public are consuming it? John, do you think that Facebook is doing the right thing here in this situation, or are they playing into the Russians' hands?
I think no matter what they do, the Russians are going to be very, very good at spinning it one way or the other. One of the things that we've seen, whether it's with Kusayanova or with previous attempts back in 2016, they will play both sides. They will have one meme page one way on one issue, one on the other. They will have people show up to an anti-Trump rally and a pro-Trump rally in New York. they will take whatever material that we give them. And again, that's why I think it's mostly on us. But I think that Facebook can do a much better job. And to some extent, you have to give them a bit of credit. They're trying. But the problem is that trying isn't enough. And for every time that they get it wrong, whether it's on purpose or not, whether it's deliberate or not, it can be interpreted, right? So if they do something with, say, the Babylon Bee that happened a while back, conservatives or evangelicals are really upset about that, and okay, they backtracked a bit. And then there was one thing that was fact-checked by, I believe it was a Weekly Standard. They fact-checked something that a liberal outlet had put on, and then the liberals got upset. And so it's a very, very delicate thing because we don't want to trample on freedom of speech. That's fundamental to the entire American project. But at the exact same time, Facebook is a gatekeeper in many ways about what is on there, and they're trying to sort that out.
Is it the right way to think about this, that it's just sort of them messing with us and engaging in some sort of master troll campaign on the American idea? Or is it too grandiose to think that it is actually tied into some of their more geopolitical goals? I mean, just a couple of years ago, we were talking about their aggression to their neighbors, the Ukraine invasion under the Obama administration. And it seems like things have been all quiet on that front for quite some time. And now we're talking about PSYOPs campaigns. When is it going to swing back the other way? And should we be watching for a pivot back to military campaigns by the Russians?
I think we should watch to see when Russia's red lines are crossed, specifically in the traditional sphere of influence in the former Soviet republics. So if Macedonia, for instance, had voted, they had a referendum recently on membership in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and technically the referendum passed, but there wasn't enough turnout to make it legitimate per the terms of the referendum. So if that referendum had sufficient turnout and it was put through and they did become a NATO member, I would believe Russia might be tempted to use military force to prevent that. So I think military campaigns are more about showing up influence and trying to veto the decisions of countries on their border from joining Western institutions such as NATO or the European Union. That, I think, is where we're likely to see military activity or the trigger for that. And I do think that of everything that we've seen here with the PSYOPs campaigns absolutely plays back into all the geopolitics. Putin's former KGB, he's a very geopolitical person. You don't try to hack into U.S. election software and platforms and websites if you don't have very firm geopolitical intent. And one last thing, given what Brad mentioned about deepfake and all of these other things and fake videos, I mean, in 2004, they were testing this way before the 2016 election. They had a fake explosion at a chemical plant in Louisiana, fake tweets, fake local news sites, fake CNN footage on YouTube, and people were convinced for a while. So they're preparing, and this is the kind of dangerous PSYOP thing or what comes next.
Brad, I want to give you sort of a final word here before we pivot topics. But do you see any way out of this here in the short term for us, just in terms of a political approach?
I think the political approach has to be responding to strength with strength. So I think there's been the issue of, Russia is mounting this hostile campaign towards us, but President Trump is going to stand up on the stage at Helsinki and act like Vladimir Putin is his best friend. So I will give the Trump administration some credit. Their actual actions and policies have sometimes been tough on Russia. For example, they've passed sanctions, right? This actor was just charged by the DOJ. They've expelled diplomats. They've done some things, but the rhetoric out of Washington has been far too friendly to Russia, given the threat that they pose. So I don't think we'll really see Russia back off until we push them away.
All right. We've been talking a bit about new age information warfare, but I'd like to round us out by discussing a recent op-ed by our guest, Mr. John Dale Grover, in the Washington Examiner about the impending reality of the Space Force. It's titled How to Avoid a Bloated Space Force, and I thought it was worth bringing up because in the realm of defense, we have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. While it takes us years to catch up on social media safety, there is a new space race of sorts underway with real national security implications. John, I've gathered that you're not really a out-front critic of the idea of Space Force in theory. What is the case to be made for this new branch of the military?
The case to be made is that we have a lot of vital national infrastructure, a lot of assets in space that frankly are rather vulnerable. And there's two components to this. The first part is they're vulnerable physically, and the second part is they're vulnerable to cyber attack. And it's a widespread consensus that, God forbid, if we ever got into a high intense conflict with a very capable adversary, Russia or China, or even possibly North Korea or Iran, depending on if they had their own hackers that were sufficient or if they had friendlies from China or Russia who were willing to assist them, that they could do a lot of damage. So that could be knocking out satellites, that could be knocking out communications. And I would expect if a major war happened, an interstate war happened, that it would be very quick. And the initial blows would go very fast, and before we know what would happen, a lot of infrastructure would be damaged. And so the question is, how do we protect it? And they're just not adequately protected at this moment.
Two questions for you, though, John. Why, in your opinion, and in President Trump's opinion, did Space Force need to be its own military branch? Why couldn't that have been an extension of a current branch? Also, you write in your op-ed about mission creep and the idea that this will start with a small, narrow purpose, but we have to keep it that way. Do you think that's unrealistic? Don't you think that it will end up becoming this giant behemoth of military bureaucracy and taking a bigger spot of the budget?
Well, I think that in the long run, it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to avoid mission creep. It's the same kind of thing that we see across the government. Most programs, they expand, they want to justify their existence, and that's a legitimate concern. Why start another branch if that's a danger? And I think that there's other ways to go about it. For instance, there's already plans to create a new combatant command, a space command, and that will be included in the 2020 defense budget. And that's a way to stand up the stuff that you would need to accomplish a similar mission without creating a whole nother branch. And I'm fine with that. You don't have to have an actual new branch of the military. But the idea that it's going to expand, I think that in the long run, yes, but that's not a reason to not create some kind of program to help deal with these threats. So for an example, GPS, everyone relies on GPS. It's on your phone. It's how you navigate on Google Maps. It's how we manage our missiles, see where the carriers are, all of this sort of things. And the military takes it for granted that if something happens, GPS is going to be one of the first things knocked offline. They're already trying to build backups to that. There was an incident in 2014, that a hacker infiltrated 30,000 U.S. Defense Department satellite phones, stealing all of that personal data. China's demonstrated capabilities to shoot down satellites. So 2007, 2010, 2013, they've had 3 different tests. Russia has launched satellites that have dual uses that could be used to physically attack, disable, or destroy our satellites. And so the idea is that we have all these assets that frankly are very, very high-tech economy and military depends on. And if anything happens to those, we will be fighting blind. We will not be able to have all these nice automated integrated systems. And the idea of all these systems is you don't want to use them, right? War's bad. We want to avoid that. But it's only as good as your deterrence. And if you can't prove that you can absolutely protect these assets, then in the right circumstances, someone might be tempted to attack them if they think that that's what they need to do to defend themselves.
There's so much there that I want to ask about to prevent the outbreak of World War III. But I'm going to back up actually to the costs of the Space Force. You wrote that official estimates could put this at more than $3 billion in its first year and an additional $10 billion over the next 4 years. We already have a spending problem in this country. John, what basic remedies do we have to try to keep the Space Force useful as a defense mechanism to us, but also not put our country even deeper underwater in terms of our spending?
So there's 2 ways that we can try to constrain spending. The first is relying to what extent we can on international law. Now, granted, it's international law. There's no world government that enforces these treaties, but they're all rules and norms. And generally speaking, the 2 foundational laws of international space law have worked by and large for the most part. There's the Outer Space Outer Space Treaty of 1967, and there's the Registration Convention of 1976. And these have largely prevented people from placing weapons in space. A lot of things that are sent up are registered with the UN, though not everything. And this has prevented an arms race for the most part. If you look at the history of the Cold War, the Soviets had a space station that had some machine gun defenses. For a while, we had some weapons up there. But the idea that anyone really went all out and said, hey, we're building Star Destroyers. Hey, we're going to build a space station up there with, dozens and dozens of nukes, and we're going to have lasers. I mean, it's a possibility that maybe someone did this at some point in time, where there's something classified we don't know about, sure. But for the most part, you don't hear people talking about a space arms race the way they do about, say, hypersonic weapons with the U.S. leaving the INF Treaty, for instance. So part of that is relying on space law to say, hey, let's try not to do this. Maybe we can modify the law. And just to elaborate on that, the problem is that a lot of the new technology we have is dual use. So you have satellites or spaceships that can both repair things and attack things, because the same capabilities to repair arms, lasers, the different kinds of things that you would reach out to pull something in or to repair are the same kind that you could use to destroy something, to damage it, to render it inoperable. And currently space law doesn't cover those dual use. So one, maybe we could lobby in the UN, talk to other people, negotiate, update space law to talk about how do we deal with these dual-use things. Maybe we keep them separate from each other. You can't have a dual-use spaceship or satellite within X range of my satellites, that kind of thing. And the second is mission creep. If we're very clear-cut about what the purpose of the Space Force is, then at least initially it would be constrained in doing other things, because the other branches will get jealous and say, hey, no, that's our turf. And the idea is it's just to protect physical assets. It's just to do X, Y, or Z, and not doing a whole bunch of other stuff.
So, John, I want to ask you off on that note, do you see any potential for Space Force and the continuing evolution of warfare in our military to actually provide opportunities to cut back in other areas? Like if we end up focusing more and more on space and protecting our satellites and our assets up in space, and then also in nuclear weapons, like you mentioned, does that simultaneously present its own challenges, but also provide a pathway for maybe rolling back our spending and our presence in traditional military operations?
I think so. I think that this shift to traditional interstate conflict is the reality. It's inevitable. It's recognizing what was already there. And I hope that in the process of that, even though we don't want to get too much into, conflict, this is a way to avoid all the endless regime change and all the endless hurrah, hurrah, let's go give everyone democracy kind of thing that we've been doing. Because nation building is not in the national interest. It's not something that the military is designed for. It's designed to protect American lives or security or economy. And the idea that somehow we should be going and, trying to remake the world in our image, that's something the Founding Fathers warned against. That's not something that we should be doing. And if we can focus on this great state competition, if we can focus on ways to deter so we never have to actually go to war, I think that's a much better bang for a buck, and we will avoid the cost of future unnecessary wars. And that also includes possibly scaling back in other areas. Personally, I wouldn't be opposed to some reduction in ground force capabilities if it meant that we could have the Space Force or focus more on the Air Force and Navy, because frankly, I think that those are more useful in deterring near-peer powers such as China than having conventional standing forces. Again, I can argue about that. But I think that's the big part of that.
Yeah. Brad and John, thank you so much for a well-rounded discussion on these issues today. What I'm wanting to underscore to close us out, the world is changing at an incredibly rapid pace. Like new innovations, new wonders, and possibilities are being unlocked every day. Alongside, we also have the rise of these new and strange threats that we've talked about, from psyops to the idea of stopping things in space in a way that we're not even familiar from the 80s. This is playing out in the misinformation campaigns against the U.S. by its global adversaries, and apparently threats again in outer space. So my parting question to both of you: what or who is the greatest threat to the United States and global stability in the next decade? What do we need to be watching for as people invested in peace, free markets, and free minds in a world where not every global power is on the same page or pursuing the same future?
Well, I'd say China definitely tops the list in my book. I think that Russia is a threat, and we need to take them very seriously. But between demographics and their economy, they're just not as much of a threat as they would be otherwise. Frankly, if they didn't have nuclear weapons, they wouldn't be very relevant. I mean, their economy is much smaller than Italy's. They're very much struggling. China is the near competitor. China's the one that's doing a lot of things with their own psyops. They're building a lot of capabilities to directly challenge us in the Pacific. I think that they're the ones that we need to be the most concerned about.
I think our biggest threat, I think Russia and China are serious threats, but I think our biggest threat is from ourselves. I think that there is a much higher likelihood that through our own political dysfunction, we throw ourselves into some kind of constitutional crisis, or if the polarization and hate for both sides keeps going, that we end up with some type of internal crisis, I think is much more likely than conflict with Russia or China, though I think they're very serious.
All right. Thank you to both my guests, John Dale Grover of The National Interest and Brad Polumbo of Young Voices and the Hot Takes podcast. This has been Underscored with Stephen Kent. You can find me on Twitter at Stephen_Kent89 and also Young Voices at YVADV. You can find Brad Polumbo at Brad_Polumbo and John at John Dale Grover on Twitter. Subscribe to this new podcast, leave us a rating, and share with your folks on social media. We'll be back next week with more. And until then, stay free.